This is our first virtual conversation this year. It is on China, as you all know. And these are truly extraordinary times. No major issue from geopolitics to the environment, the economy, to trade. Basically, nothing can be discussed without taking into account a more assertive China. And these are very early days, but since the UK left the European Union, both seem to have embarked on rather different paths of how to deal with China. The UK restricts imports of, for example, cotton picked by Uyghurs in China, and the EU has agreed on an investment deal with China last December. Now, a lot of parliamentarians don't agree with everything on China, and therefore they reach out to one another. And both speakers are co-signatories to an open letter of parliamentarians of G7 nations, calling on their governments to work jointly and addressing core issues on China. I'm therefore very delighted and happy to have both Tom Tugendhat and David McAllister with us tonight to discuss the EU and UK's perspectives on China. Welcome you both. The speakers are very well known, so they don't need much of introduction. Tom is the chairman of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and he's also the chair of the China Research Group. And David is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. And equally to Tom, he is concerned about an assertive China and advocates a more coherent foreign policy of the European Union and closer relations to the UK. And now, let us start our discussion. Tom, you go first. Thank you very much for being with us. You have the floor for about 7 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Felix. It's a pleasure to see you again, and it's a particular pleasure to be with my very dear friend, David. We see the world in rather too similar a way, I think, for many people in both our jurisdictions, but that level of cooperation at least means that we're able to work well together. We're talking today about a change that really has affected the UK and Europe over the last 6 or 7 years. The evolution of our China relationship has come about really since 2 or 3 years into General Secretary Xi's reign in Beijing, and a changed attitude that we're seeing in terms of influence and activity by a Chinese Communist Party that has changed its role from merely internal to looking to shape the world around it. And it's worth thinking just for a moment why China is doing that and what legitimacy it has to do it, and why it's also challenging to us. The first question is really, why is it legitimate? Of course, China is now, or about to be, the world's largest economy. It's certainly the world's most populous nation. Well, probably not very much longer. Actually, India's catching up on that level. But it's a country that has quite rightly decided that it wants to have its voice heard in global organization and indeed in many regions that it's formerly not operated in. This is not unreasonable. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, for various different reasons, it's certainly true that China wasn't a major global player, and therefore it's not surprising that it wishes to shape the world a little bit more in its own image. But the challenge remains for the rest of us that this is not simply a rising power, or rather a reasserting power, which is seeking to find its own place in the world. It is actually an operational challenge. This is a systems challenge to the entire global system. Because what we're seeing today is we are seeing concepts that we don't share of state control, of community rather than individual rights, being asserted at a level that we have formerly thought them established. We're seeing, for example, through the Belt and Road Initiative, the methods that we used quite understandably to develop poorer areas of China to connect areas of the world that were formerly much more within our own areas of understanding. So we're seeing challenges, really fundamental challenges to the way in which the world works. And as part of those challenges, we need to have a response. Now, the response from the UK has been somewhat mixed, and we have certainly seen it sharpen up in recent years, partly, I would argue, due to pressure from parliamentarians, but also partly due to pressure from the United States and Australia and the realization that what we're seeing out of General Secretary Xi is different from what we were seeing before. When China joined the WTO and around 20 years ago, what we were seeing was China moving towards a greater integration with the global economy, and what many of us hoped was a greater integration with global systems of governance as well, with individual rights, with perhaps even in the very, very distant future, some form of democratization of that nation. But what we've seen instead is the pressure of Chinese norms being pushed elsewhere. And I think for many of us, the canary in the coal mine is Australia. Over the last year or 2 years, we've seen increasingly pressure applied to Australian systems of governance, to its economic levers, but also to its entire society. And in many ways, this has come as a warning. Now, it's not just Australia. It's actually much closer to home. Now, I don't know how many of you will remember, but only a few months ago, Heiko Maas called out his Chinese opposite number in a most un-German way at a press conference shortly after the Chinese foreign minister had been particularly blunt about the Czech foreign affairs group going to Taiwan. And we've seen the ambassador to Sweden and the ambassador to France behaving in ways that, frankly, former Chinese diplomats never would have. So we're seeing increasing assertion of Chinese rights even here. And this is why, I'm sure this will come up in questions, but this is why many of us are now calling for a clearer stance against what we're seeing. This is not a statement of being anti-Chinese. Many of us would argue, in fact, I argue very strongly, that what we're arguing for is actually, oh, forgive me, that will stop in a moment. And no, David, I'm not going to go and vote, I'm proxied. What we will see in what many of us are calling for in coming years is fundamentally in China's interests. China's economic growth, after all, lifting 850 million people out of poverty, was not achieved by communism. It was achieved by the liberal international order that I would argue we are defending when we stand up for the rights and the values that we share. Now, I'm going to stop there because this is going to drive all of us insane, so I'll wait for questions.
It's a pleasure to speak to you today on this relevant topic, and I think it's important that after the British withdrawal from the European Union, that the centre and the centre-right remain in these kind of formats in exchange of views. Now, Tom Tugendhat and I have something in common, not only that we both chair the Foreign Affairs Committees of our respective parliaments, but we're often together on panels. And Tom will remember that just a couple of weeks ago, the two of us met with, digitally, virtually, with the then chairman of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Chairman Risch, to discuss possible future venues of cooperation between our free parliaments on the very relevant topic of China. We had a fruitful exchange, I thought, Tom, at that time, and all agreed that we, as parliamentarians, have a strong role to play in shaping a coordinated response to some of the challenges posed by the communist leadership in Beijing. In dealing with China, you often hear here in Brussels the three C's. Letter C: cooperate where possible, compete where needed, confront where necessary. And I think this gives us some guidance how to deal with China. What we have seen in recent months is that the COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated China's assertiveness and foreign policy ambitions. It has also exposed further the necessity for us as Western democracies to pool our resources together in the fight against the pandemic, but also in the fight against disinformation and the protection of our democratic values. Even before the pandemic, we were concerned with unfair Chinese trade practices and the disrespect for human rights. We all condemned the imposition of the Hong Kong national security law and its detrimental impact on the respect of the rule of law. But we are all deeply worried by Chinese expansionism and assertiveness on a wide range of foreign policy and economic issues. So I do believe that a coordinated approach of like-minded democracies to some of the challenges posed by China is more necessary than ever. Cooperation with China on global issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic or mitigating climate change is inevitable. However, we should strive to cooperate with China where appropriate, when we should keep it anchored and accountable in the international system. The concerns we are sharing as regards Chinese behavior must be addressed. These include unfair trade practice, cybersecurity, disinformation, and the quest for technological dominance. What you can observe here in Brussels is that the European Union is increasingly more united in its stance towards China, as well as also more critical. So our take here is if China wants to cooperate with us, they have to deliver on their promises on trade practices, human rights, and climate change. China is quite clear in its ambition. It wants a technology sector that is free from geopolitically sensitive dependencies, and indeed wants a dominant position in all technologies that are likely to play a central role in the future role of warfare. This has potentially far-reaching strategic consequences for the European Union and the whole Western democratic world, not just on trade, but on security as well. So final point, I see future cooperation of like-minded democracies on how to deal with China effectively on 4 fronts: technology, multilateralism, human rights, and foreign policy issues. What does that mean concretely? First, on technology, we should pool joint funding and cooperation efforts on enduring technologies to compete with China. Second, concerning multilateralism, like-minded democratic partners should stand stronger together to defend a rules-based order and work together on reforming international organizations to be better fit for the service and protection of the global rule-based order. The United States should be leading, not leaving international organizations. And please allow me this remark, it's always better to lead than to leave. The third point on human rights, cooperation among Western democracies would be very much appreciated. Among legislators, we are strongly positioned to intensify dialogue and bring into the spotlight human rights violations. And finally, we definitely shouldn't ignore the field of foreign policy. Chinese influence in Africa and in the Indo-Pacific region, but also much closer to us in the Western Balkans, for instance, or in Eastern Europe, should be very carefully monitored. We should intensify cooperation in order to limit Chinese, just as Russian propaganda, and further support the pursuit of these countries for democratic values. So I welcome the announcement of the new president of the United States to form an alliance of democracies. We're in this together. The United States, Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, just to name a few. And let's try to, together, analyze the importance of China's global ambition, and let's enhance coordination and share information on our approaches. I'll keep it there. Thank you.